Today, this is lecture 4. This is lecture number 4 in Self and Society, Social Phenomenology. It's titled Self Problems on your handout. I'll tell you in advance, kind of a little bit like last time. It's like last Tuesday. It's a difficult lecture for me. It's hard to organize it well. It's hard to figure out where to start, and that's not an accident. One of the topics that came up that's come up in the last couple of weeks has been the ambiguity of situational definitions and the ambiguity of what the self is, and what it means to have a body, and kind of the ill-defined, somewhat open-ended nature of life and decisions and what those are and so on. So I think this will work out okay, but who knows? And we're starting to get into, really kind of what the course is about is the problem of free will and determinism, kind of. And our lives as living embodied creatures kind of exemplifies, it kind of tells you where that problem comes from, why that's a problem. That is, on the one hand, we are physical objects in the world that, get hit by other objects and then move this way and that way. Or we are chemical compounds. We're these masses of chemical things going on, and you introduce, it's amazing. You can take a tiny little pill and suddenly everything changes quite dramatically. How did that happen? Well, because we are these physical objects that have a lot of molecules in them and so on, and things happen and gurgle around, and next thing you know, you fall in love or get angry or something. And it seems as if that's all kind of biologically or biochemically determined. And then on the other hand, people are kind of unpredictable. And we go off in strange directions now and then. And it certainly, from the first person point of view, it certainly feels like we have what we might call freedom. I could walk out the door right now, but I probably won't. Right? So at least experientially or theoretically or something, we seem to have these open-ended futures, and yet we are still really quite object-like, sort of like other things are object-like, but there are obvious differences, okay? And so figuring out that ambiguity and sort of how far you can go with the idea of we're free, or how far you can go with the idea of we're objects, that's kind of what we're exploring here. Because it's one of the great mysteries of life. It's one of the great mysteries of social science, is where I was going to go with that. That people can be ontologically free, and yet they sure act like they aren't in lots of ways. In lots of ways, people are quite predictable, especially when you talk about them in groups. So that's I hope that gives you some sense of where we're going with this. Now, the reading for this week is great. It's Oliver Sacks' book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which is really a long selection of a whole bunch of different essays. Some are very short, some are long. They're fun. They're interesting. They're really interesting. I think you'll enjoy them. The selections that I put on the syllabus, you can read those selections. You should. But if you want to read others, feel free. If you want to read the whole book, don't let me stop you, because it's great. And if you just read a bunch of different essays in the book, you'll get the idea. The ideas that we're going at. You needn't read specific ones, that is, because he keeps returning to the same themes over and over again. But it's a fabulous book because the guy who wrote it, Oliver Sacks, is a neurologist. That is to say, he's a doctor who studies nerve problems, I suppose is the simplest way to put it. Nervous system problems. But he's a real thoughtful, sensitive guy, as many neurologists are, by the way. I'm just telling you, I don't know if any of you know any, but they tend to be interesting characters. But he's quite sensitive to the fact that we're not just physical creatures. in a simple way at all. And that there's a lot of this kind of mind-body problem stuff going on in a lot of his work. Anyway, I think you'll enjoy the book, so I recommend it highly. Now, last week, we started talking about what is the self. Okay, and we said a couple of things. One is that when we say the self, that includes that I have a notion of who I am. We might say a stereotype, almost, of who I am. That you have a picture in your mind. Yeah, you have a picture in your mind or an idea or a set of ideas that kind of describe who you are. And you can probably scribble them out on a sheet of paper pretty quickly, at least in very broad outline. So that seems to be part of it. And we read Goffman's essay on face work and see how, in some ways, other people allow us to be the person we want to be, or they don't allow us to be. Or we take a line when we're in a situation with people. In other words, a kind of a direction or a statement of who we are and how we're going to act. And then other people, in various ways, enforce that. So that's, the self is all of that. But it's also, and this is really important to remember, if nothing else, I'm a physical body. All right? So when you think about who you are, at the outset, fundamentally and sine qua non, without which nothing else matters, you are a physical person. And you're not just a physical person, you're this physical person. You're one unique, very specific individual physical person. And the peculiarities of that, for instance, your height, or your sex, or your race, or whatever, all of that is just fundamental to who you are. Can't escape it. And the weird thing is that that's true not just of you, that's true of everybody. There's no such thing as a typical person in that sense, right? Everybody is a unique, physically unique individual. And it's the only way we have of being in the world. That's it. Without it, you can't do anything. And if it changes in some amazingly minor ways, it can dramatically alter the way you deal with the rest of the world. All right? So, like I said, if you break a finger, suddenly you discover how important your hand is. Much less, God forbid, you lose a limb. And everything has to be reoriented, and what you are and what you can do and how you operate and so on gets quite dramatically changed. Now, the body is fundamental, well, in a lot of different ways, and we'll come back to this actually, but you get a hint of how important your body is, again, when things go wrong, when you're sick, or when you're injured, or when you're threatened. So it might be that you feel most alive when you're most physically involved in something. Examples for me are dancing, actually. I like to dance. And I used to really love to dance when I was able to do it a lot better than I am now. And it's cool, right? And there you are, and stuff's happening. And it's kind of magical, actually, because it combines your existence as a physical object in the world with this kind of miracle of being able to move and do things and so on. And then when you're threatened, of course, you also feel alive. So if there's a lot of stuff, I read a lot of military history, and there are a lot of guys who, in some interesting ways, sort of enjoy being in combat, all right? Not that they like getting shot at or blown up or anything, and it's terrifying and whatnot, but it's also exhilarating because you know you're there and there's no getting around it. It's not stuff you read in the media of the country. It's not like a video game, all right? Because in a video game, you can pop back up again, all right? And when you know that the stakes are real for you and for everybody around you and so on, it totally changes everything, right? So when you're physically vulnerable, or when you're, like I say, you're dancing might be another thing, or when you're sick. All of that works and makes you feel very, very alive and in the moment and immediate and so on. Now that can be used by people who want to get your attention. So when they talk about sex and violence in the media, why sex and violence? What do they have in common? Well, what they have in common is their physical immediacy to people. Your attention is completely focused on what you're doing. Okay, in sex and violence. I mean, not always. Okay, you watch TV or something, but generally speaking, right? Those two things tend to focus your attention on being right here in the moment, absolutely with with nothing else going on. And so when they want to get your attention in a movie, they show you either violence or sex, right? Because boom, you have to be there. You got to keep eyes on the screen, that sort of thing. Sporting events could have the same sort of effect, right? That there's a kind of immediacy. I'm not a football fan at all, but I watched the Super Bowl a couple of weeks ago, and I have to say the second half of that game was really good. I mean, it was really good. And there's something exciting about watching people. Or I went to a Syracuse basketball game Sunday, and I don't care. God bless you if you're a Syracuse basketball fan, okay? I'm fine with it. But my wife cares. So that sort of gets me a little more interested. But there we are. And, you watch a guy, like, what an alley-oop kind of play is? You know what they're talking about? Where one guy's dribbling down, and he passes to a fellow who's already jumped up and catches the ball here and then slams it down through the hoop. Just describing that just now, I got goosebumps. Okay? I mean, that's pretty cool. And part of the reason it's cool is I kind of think I could do it. Like, I'm not real life. But I swear, I have dreams that involve me dunking basketballs. All right? I'm not the only person who's had that dream. Awake or not, right? But it's kind of exhilarating watching people do that. And the same is true for all sorts of sporting events, is that there's a kind of vicarious pleasure in watching somebody else. So I'm way too old to swim, obviously, like people do at Hamilton meets. But I go to a meet every now and then, and I see somebody really do, have a great, I get excited because I'm kind of feeling myself do it a little bit. So physical immediacy is a compelling sort of thing. And so when we talk about the self and what gets us to operate in certain ways, or in the second half, of course, what makes us do predictable things, you've got to account for the fact that we're profoundly embodied creatures. Now, most social science, through most of history, has not taken that into account, precisely because it's trying to be objective. That is to say, it's trying to adopt a third-person point of view that looks at human beings as if they're kind of quasi-physical objects that get moved around the way that physics moves other objects around. Right? So it tends to leave out this particular part of experience, but we're going to try to hold on to it. Okay, now the body, I'm going to talk, okay. This embodiedness epitomizes presence. Don't worry about the words here, okay? I'm just trying to convey an idea. These aren't jargon terms you have to memorize or anything like that. Right? I'm just trying to convey an idea. But this business of presence, meaning here I am in the present, presence is a great word because it's so ambiguous. It has a bunch of different meanings, and we can play with all of them. So it means, for instance, by presence, the body has presence, means I'm physically here, like present, I'm here, available for roll call. It also means that you're present in time. Okay, that turns out to be important because things in the future haven't happened. Things in the past are done. Being present suggests a different kind of existence. That is, you can do things now and make stuff happen in a way that's quite powerful. It also suggests that you're socially vulnerable. You know, you're in the presence of other people. And for Sartre in particular, that turns out to be real important. He thinks of a fundamental element of human existence as being the fact that others look at us. That you're an object in other people's world. And that turns out to be real important. Okay, but mainly here I'm thinking presence means I can do things, but I can also screw up, right? Or I can do things, but I'm also vulnerable. Or, to put it differently, I exist as subject and object at the same time. All right, so philosophically, you know, there's this whole thing about the mind and the body, or we might say the subject and the object. Am I a subject? Am I an object? What I mean by presence is that our bodily existence projects us as being both of those at the same time. All right? So we'll cover both sides of it, but a lot of implications. All right. In Sartrean terms, it means I'm alive in a situation, right? That I face the world and I can do stuff, but I'm responsible for what I do simultaneously. Good? Or in Goffman's terms, you know, Goffman has this thing about anytime you're in a situation with other people, you're constantly, whether you want to or not, you're constantly giving off information to other people. Or that's what he says in Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. In the article you read, he says that when you walk into a situation, no matter what you do, you're taking a line. You're projecting yourself as a certain kind of person, even if you stand there and don't do anything. That in itself is doing something. All right? It's one of the tragedies of being alive, is that there's no escape from giving off information, from being somebody or other. You know this when you go to your college interview. I don't know. Did you do an interview when you applied to college? Had to go and meet with admissions, and your mom says something really worthless like, just be yourself. And you realize, like, who's that? What does that mean, to be yourself? Hi, okay, I'll act normal in this totally abnormal situation. Or I'll try to be real nice all the time when I'm not. I don't know what it means. What do I do? What do I say? Or writing a college essay is another one. Say, tell us about yourself. Where do you start? There's no obvious answer, because part of who you are is the freedom to be different people. So you can't just be yourself. Your mom had the right idea, okay? I'm not arguing. She didn't. And there was something serious she was saying there, but you can't just be yourself. It doesn't really work. Okay. So all right, so let's start from the basics again. All right, so what that means is that there are two sides to having an embodied self. No, not having. Okay. See, that doesn't work. You don't have an embodied self. You are an embodied self. If I say you had it, that would suggest that you exist over here, and then you say, okay, I need a self. And you come over and pick one up. Now I have a self. It's embodied. Doesn't work. This is who you are. Okay, so there are two sides to being an embodied self. How's that? Being a particular embodied self. All right. The one side is action. The other side is what we could think of as, sometimes thought of as passion, but that's not quite right, but being passive, being an object, a subject or an object is kind of where we're going. So on the one hand, there's action, like you can do things. Again, dance is this great metaphor for it. There was this guy named Nijinsky. You know dance? Anybody know Nijinsky? No? No. Ring a bell? All right, you've heard of Stravinsky? He's a composer, right? Wrote things like The Firebird and The Rite of Spring and so on. So Nijinsky, I forget his first name, was the dancer who starred in these things. And he was supposed to be fabulous. But I don't think there are any recordings. You know, there are no visual recordings because it was like 1912 or something. Movies were pretty primitive. I don't think they have any recordings of, you know, so he danced, and you read these descriptions. Oh, it sounds fabulous. And you sort of try to imagine, but you can't imagine, right? Because you haven't seen it. You haven't seen it. There's no, and people go, well, there's this record of how it was done. Well, that doesn't help. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is that when you watch a dance, or when you watch the basketball player, it would be a comparable thing, right? So there are certain plays in that game where you go, woo, it's elegant. I mean, it is. It's dance, right? Really good basketball. The athleticism and the grace and the coordination and all this good stuff. But it loses a lot when you read about it. Let me just put it that way. You have to see it to really get it. And in fact, it's better to see it live. It's much better to see it live. It's not the same as a highlight tape. Highlight tapes are great, you know, I like watching those. But being there live and seeing it happen, there's a magic to it because it didn't have to happen. When you watch it live, there it is, and then it's gone. And that's over. And anytime you re-watch it, it won't be the same, right? Because it doesn't have that element of unpredictability to it. The same way that if you go to a live concert, the music, I find, I went to a concert in Lincoln Center a couple years ago of the Brandenburg Concertos. It's a great piece of music. And they were playing it, and I was just riveted. It was a string quartet, I think, playing these things. No, that's not possible. Yeah, it was. I think it was. It was. It was a small group, very small group. But it was amazing. And part of what was amazing was I knew at any moment they could mess up. Right? So it's not the same as a recording because it's live, and that there's something to that livingness that just can't be recaptured. Okay. So one thing is that our bodies allow us to live in that sense, to do unpredictable things or risky things and so on. And Hubert Dreyfus, who we will read a book by near the end, he wrote a book, I forget what it's called, something like What Computers Can't Do. It's an argument against artificial intelligence. He said there are things computers cannot do because they're not embodied. And we'll get to that. Okay. All right. It also means, this embodiedness means I can create all sorts of things. Not just physical things, but I can, for instance, create situations, which we've already talked about to some extent. I can make, this is what Sartre is all about, right? Is I can make the world be valued in different ways. I can decide that golf is just this incredibly important thing. And every day I go out and I play golf for 5 hours and I talk about golf and I think about it. And suddenly golf becomes important. And people say, oh, you're just hitting a little ball into a little hole. What's that about? Well, that's their opinion. But I can give my life, so to speak, to make something more valuable. Different example of that would be when someone dies. You can grieve or not. You have that, so to speak, choice. Now, that doesn't mean you choose it, as in you sit there and say, well, gosh, my grandma passed away. Should I be upset? That's not what happens. It's not like you have to go through a cognitive process. But with yourself, you make a statement as to how you respond. Right? So, a common thing, they say when somebody close to you passes away, you feel like you've been kicked in the stomach, right? This is true. Like you'll double over and fall on the floor. I don't want it to happen to you often in your life, but it happens, right? So you go, oh. I mean, my mom, I go, oh, crash. And that's, why is that? I mean, what's going on there? Some part of what's going on there is a declaration of how important that person was. You're giving that person's life a kind of value in your own body to where you physically feel it when they're not with you anymore. And you've done it, we might say, existentially, that is to say spontaneous. It was a living choice, not a choice like you sat there and wrote out the pros and cons on a piece of paper, like when you're picking a college or something. You just make a declaration. Here's the kind of person I am. Right away, spontaneously. I think I gave you the example earlier of the mug, right? that I had this New York World Fair mug, and the fella dropped it, and I was like, what do you do? Well, I actually had a moment of decision where I could think about it for an eighth of a second or something. And I decided it wasn't going to be important. Big whoop. Okay. And people do that with lots of other things. I think I also gave you the example the first day I tore a $20 bill. Was that in here? Yes? Mm-hmm. Good. Didn't want to throw away a good example. But, you know, that you can, in a sense, decide that money is or isn't important to you in various ways. There are lots of things like that. But there are other things you can create. You can create other people. Okay, a little tip. So this is very Goffmanian. That you allow people to be or not be certain kinds of folks. So, here, easy example actually is, I tend to assume the best of students, right? I don't have a concrete example right now, but I just noticed in talking with different colleagues of mine in my profession, some of them have a much more negative view of students than I have. I don't know why, but to some extent it was a deliberate choice early in my career. I just said, just start assuming that they're trying to do things right, you know, or that they want to learn, or they're not cheating, or I don't know what it would be, right? And my modest experience has been is that that actually works. That is, people sort of live up to that, or you sort of get off on the right foot with people, might be another way to say it. So if you sort of assume the best of people, a lot of times they'll come through. Not all the time, right? I've certainly had people I've known, not students in particular, but you know, where you sort of keep thinking they're, well, they, you know, she probably means well, you know, that kind of thing. And turns out, well, no, she didn't. But I don't know. It sort of feels to me like it's worth it, but like because anyway. So let me give you a different example of this, though. When I was in 7th and 8th grade, I took dancing classes. And I don't mean like jazz or any of that. It was ballroom dancing. And with a lady named Mrs. Howell, who ran a little school in Chattanooga, Tennessee, for young gentlemen, young ladies. And she said, Mr. Chambliss, this is Margaret Howell calling. I'll tell you a couple of stories about her eventually, but not right now. She's funny. So, what was the point of this one? Oh, okay. So Mrs. Howell ran these dancing classes all the time for all the young gentlemen and ladies in Chattanooga of our social circle. And she had, all right, cut to the chase here. What's the point of the story? Okay. She had a young lady in one of her classes who apparently wasn't very popular. I think she was not particularly attractive physically, was kind of the deal. And somehow or other, Mrs. Howell mentioned this to somebody, or what was it? Oh no, she mentioned to one of the guys, one of the boys in the class, and said it was on the line of she needs a date for this dance, is what it was, right? She was always setting people up. She set me up in a few. Anyway, and she got this guy to do it. And this guy, he got together with a group of his friends, and he said, you know, it's really kind of a shame. I mean, she's quite nice. This girl was really nice and stuff, but she was just kind of, that's what it was. She was just kind of, you know, kind of hanging on, kind of frumpy and not very done up and not real interested in boys, or I don't know what it was, all right? This was all secondhand from Mrs. Howell. She told me the story. Anyway, the point is, the guy got together with 3 of his friends and says, oh, all right, we got to make sure this girl goes to the dances. That's the point. And there was like one a month, there would be these dances, you know, where they have a band or music or something. People go, and so he calls her up the first time to ask her to the dance. And she's like stunned, seemed to be the response. Okay. And but because he was, you know, he seemed to be a reasonably popular guy. So she's like, what's going on here? Is this something weird? So they go to the dance. Works out okay, whatever. The second guy a month later, second guy calls up and says, you know, would you like to go to the dance? She's like, well, okay, whatever, you know. And she goes to the dance. The third time, right, the third guy calls her up, third week. She's like, yeah, okay, well, yeah, that'd be good. Pretty good. Okay. A month later, the fourth guy calls her up. She already had a date. Okay? That she had responded. You know, you start getting this kind of attention, and the guys were legit, and the guys were nice guys. Okay? I mean, they weren't like, wouldn't it be funny, you know, fake her out or something. That wasn't the point. They were trying to, you know, make sure she had a nice time and went to the dances. And by the end of the deal, she felt like she was popular. You know, she starts dressing differently, and she starts acting differently, and she's a little more, you know, hi, you know, and come, right? Next thing you know, she's doing great. So that sort of thing actually does work. You can actually create other people in that sense, in the way that you respond to them, and how people react to them, and so on. And you know that from your own life. You're in different situations with different groups of people, and you feel differently. And then you behave quite differently and act differently. I'm always grateful to students in classes, actually, because you let me be a decent teacher. Okay, if you wanted, you could crush any teacher you wanted in a matter of an hour if you got together and did it. Okay, just by the way you respond. So I say something I think's funny, and you're gonna, right? Or you decide to start not paying attention. Like people start doodling a lot and doing this kind of stuff. I'll react real fast to that. I'm like, oh God, something wrong, like this. So do other teachers. You can change the way they operate. So the way a class operates depends on this kind of interaction, all right, between everybody who's involved. Okay, you can create things like your past. Now, for instance, you can deliberately make memories, which I know people try to do, right? Let's go do something memorable. Let's have a big splashy wedding would be a great example of that kind of approach. But that's not the most interesting part. The interesting version of this is selective memory. So you decide, in a sense, what things you're going to remember from your past. And I know people, you know, who fixate on bad things in their past and think about them over and over and over and over, and just can't let them go. So then that's a permanent part of who they are, rather than think about certain good things that have happened and how that worked out. Or people who, I heard somebody on the radio the other day was talking about, she'd written a book, I think, God forbid. She'd written a book, and it was about, you know, she said, well, this all started when I discovered that my great-great-grandfather was a something or other. I don't even remember what it was. I'm like, wait a minute. Your great-great-grandfather was a, you know, I don't know, duke or something, you know, or prince of something in Poland. Or, you know, your great, what do you mean your great-great-grandfather, singular? Do you know how many great-great-grandfathers you have? 8. Okay? And you've got 16 great-great-grandparents. Why'd you pick that one? Because he was a prince. That's why you picked him. Yeah, what about all the losers? You didn't pick them, right? Just sheer arithmetic. So when people say, you know, I'm descended from Pocahontas or whatever, which a number of people are, right? A lot of people are. And somebody lived across the street from me when I was a kid. And her name was Pocahontas. I'm not making this up. And her mother's name was Pocahontas, her grandmother's name. Because by God, they weren't going to let anybody forget. You know, but if you go back that many generations, there were thousands of people that you could have picked from. One of whom was Pocahontas. Anyway, all right, I'm kind of getting off track here. So you decide, you get to choose things like your past. And you get to create yourself in lots of other ways. Most powerfully, I think, by choosing the people you spend time with. So, I've just written a book, and it's one of the things it says that in college, the crucial thing is who you spend time with. That's the crucial thing about your college experience, and probably about everything else in life, but, right? Find who's the group of people you hang out with. Who are the teachers you follow? Who are the other kids you spend your evenings tooting around with? That sort of thing. And if you find your life is messed up, rethink who you're spending time with, because that probably has some big impact. You even choose your advisors, as Sartre said. You decide who are the people you're going to take advice from. You're picking that. And not always deliberately. Usually it's just the person who happens to live next door to you. Or you've got a problem and you're lying there on your bed and your roommate says, what's the matter? And you start talking. But you can go and make a decision to move in other directions with that. All right, so in all these ways you create who you are, even down to the level of food. You create yourself physically, and it becomes really obvious the older you get when you've eaten too much sugar in your life and stuff, and you get diabetes, right? Or you eat a lot of junk and don't exercise, and you get heart disease. And in that sense, you really are creating your body. And so at your age, that isn't showing up quite so much. But in a sense, you say, well, over here I'm like a bag of Cheez-Its, because you ate it and there it is. And over here I'm like organic tomatoes. I don't know, take your pick. But you eat. And so in lots of ways you create who you are, right? In all these different ways I've described. On the other hand, you're also an object. Okay? You're a physical object in the world. And therefore you're, to some extent, passive. Passive's not the right word, but we're working on it. That is to say, stuff can happen to you. Okay? So there's the creative part, and then there's stuff can happen to you. Initially I had down here passion. I think I modified it on your outline. But the idea of passion is that you're alive, obviously, but you're caught up in something beyond your control. And the word gets misused a lot now. Students now use this on application essays. I have a passion for such and such. And I'm thinking, well, if you were that passionate about it, you wouldn't be here. You'd be out doing it. But that's just me, right? The passion is something you're caught up in, you can't help yourself, you're carried away. Lust being the obvious example. So we have guinea pigs, right, at home. We have 3 guinea pigs. Well, for whatever reason, we have 2 males we got from some other people, and they're in one big cage. And one of those little guys, he's got passion. And I spent yesterday, I was working. I'm working away. All day long, this one guinea pig was going after the other guinea pig. Okay, maybe this is not an appropriate story. Anyway, but that's passion, right? I'm in love, right? He's going. But anyway, so you're a physical object, you're carried away by something outside of yourself. Different examples, Sartre talks about what he calls the look. And he has these essays describing what it's like to be impaled by the look of another person. That is, you're the victim of their glance or their stare. It can be very uncomfortable. I don't know if you ever had anybody stare at you. It's not good. It's not good. I was in a nightclub in Iceland once, and some big Norwegian-looking fellow. You've been in nightclubs in Iceland?
Not yet.
Have you heard about them?
Yes.
They're big. I mean, this is 20 years ago, but it's a huge nightclub scene in Iceland. It's a case, it's the only time one of the rare times at least, in my life I can remember when I thought, that guy doesn't like my looks. I mean, he literally, I don't like your, he's glowering at me. He's like 6'4". He's some guy named Thor. And he tried to start a fight with me. You understand? I'm in a foreign country. I'm little. I'm like, this sort of thing. But you can't. What do? I hadn't done a thing. He just picked me out. So impaled. Yeah. Okay. So let's go on here. So passion can be positive or negative in all sorts of ways. I refer to the Passion of Christ and so on. There are literary references we can get into, but okay. So if being alive allows for creativity and for doing stuff with my freedom, right? It also means stuff can be done to you, that you're victimizable. Even at the level, my own creations can be misused. Okay, so I can go out and try to do something, but other people can misunderstand it or misinterpret it. This class being a great example. I've had students, okay, so generally speaking, I think this course goes well. Looks good, right? But there are students who on evaluations will say things like, Chambliss just likes talking about himself, right? Or enjoys telling semi-dirty stories in class. has a Napoleon complex, like all little guys. I don't, I swear. I mean, if it's Napoleon, it's in this room, okay, that's it. It ain't nowhere else in my life. But, you know, you try to do something, and people can say, no, that's stupid. Or I don't appreciate that, or whatever. Or, and you know, and inadvertently, I mean, it can happen in all kinds of ways. Some years ago, I was in love with this woman. This is a long time back, actually. I say that in case my wife watches this. So, you know, I was in love with this woman. Things are great, you know. We're in her kitchen one morning, right? And, you know, she's like getting water for tea or something. I walk over, and I spontaneously burst into song. I was overwhelmed. And she says, "Who told you you could sing?" I was utterly deflated, you know? And I mean, you know, we got along great. You know, she did other things, and she was real nice to me and stuff like that, generally. But at this one moment, she just makes this remark, you know, like, I'm giving you this beautiful gift. Of my, you understand, this is a spontaneous overflowing of love. And it's like, who told you you could sing? You know, or you open the door for somebody, and they think you're being patronizing. Right? Or you're trying to be nice and they take it the wrong way. And again, you probably all know people who do that, who just misunderstand anything you say. Or, God forbid, you're a politician. So, any example works there. I remember just Obama's thing in the last, in the campaign in the fall where he launched on this thing about, you know, if you start a business, you know what I'm talking about? Start a business, you know, and you work hard, build it up. But, you know, you didn't build the roads that was, and you didn't build the schools or hire the teachers or whatever who train these people. You know, you didn't build all that. And, you know, it gets taken by his opponent, and the film clips are stuck together. So he says, you start a business, you didn't build that. I'm like, you know, I can't imagine being in that situation where you're like, fellas, I'm just trying to explain an important idea here. And you're going to clip this part and then say, I said this. And it's a lie. But people, you know, politicians on all sides, you get lied about all the time. That's what happens, right? You say something and then it's misinterpreted or turned against you or something of that sort. Or imagine things like artworks. Okay, Vincent van Gogh, great example. Famously pours his soul into trying to express things in paintings. And then, you know, 50 years later, some German investor buys one of them for $110 million. I mean, when that sort of thing happens, it's fine with me if people buy and sell artworks, okay? But you think, is this what Van Gogh had in mind? You know, like he was trying to, you know, sell paintings for lots of, he didn't make any money on this, you know. Years later, other people are doing things and saying, I have a Van Gogh. And he might say, well, not really. Because you just missed the whole point. Right? Or I was listening there a few years ago on the radio somewhere, there was some public radio station I was listening to, there was a show, and they said, Book World on at 3:30. And I said, Book World, that's, you know, I'm good with that, I read books. So I turn on the show. And these people start talking, these guys start talking. And there's like, well, this guy had this book from like 1820, and it was this first edition in the lab. It turns out what they were talking about is how much you could sell them for. The whole show is like Antiques Roadshow. You know, the whole thing was about how much money you could get. So they were neither talking. I thought there were a couple of possibilities going into this show. They were neither discussing the book qua set of ideas, you know, or as a story, or the literary value, nor were they discussing an ancient book or a real old book as a physical object. Oh, beautiful, you know, calfskin binding with gold tool board. They weren't doing that. They were talking about it as a commodity. How much can you buy and sell? They could be talking about a chunk of gold or a brick or I don't know, anything. Right? Just how much you could buy or sell for. So this isn't book world. This is like buy and sell world. It's like Pawn Stars or something. If you watch that, it's kind of weird. But so again, you know, so somebody wrote this book and somebody made this product and so on, and then again it gets misused or taken in a different way. Now the greatest example of that, of course, is having children. So set aside my case, okay, because I have stepchildren who I came into later. But let's say you have children physically, right? And they're your kids, and you bring them up and you give them everything you can do, and you try. And one day, you know, the kid's 15, and you say, you know, "Where are you going?" And the kid says, you know, spits out an obscenity and walks out the door. You're like, "What was? I'm trying here," you know. You know, and or your kid goes off in some weird direction or turns out bad or something. Heaven forbid. Right? That's horrible sort of thing. Frankenstein myth is all about that kind of thing. It's about trying to make something or do good for the world, and it all goes wrong. So a great example of this. Great example of this. Then I'll go on. Winston Churchill. Okay, you all know who Winston Churchill was, I assume. Maybe. All right. So there's World War II. The Nazis invade France. Britain stands alone. Churchill becomes prime minister and says, "We're never going to give up." Now, the history of this is well worth reading, by the way, because it turns out it was a really, really close call as to whether Britain was going to continue or not. But that aside, Churchill saw himself, in grandiose terms, saw himself as stemming the tide of Nazism and basically saving the world for democracy. And he was right. You know, I mean, he actually probably deserves that. But he spent his whole career doing that. I mean, his whole large chunk of his career dealing with this kind of thing and trying to stop the Nazis. And then there's, you know, the U.S. enters the war and Russia gets invaded and all the rest, right? So eventually they defeat Adolf Hitler, who was a bona fide, really, really bad guy, right? And wanted to conquer the world. And there's a serious argument to be made that Winston Churchill stopped him, basically, okay? I mean, there were a lot of other people involved, but at the crucial moment, Winston Churchill stopped Hitler from conquering the world. True. On the other hand, what that did was that allowed Joseph Stalin, right, Soviet Union, to rule half of Europe for the next 50 years. I mean, Stalin is. And Joseph Stalin was an authentically evil guy, kind of like Hitler. And Churchill was aware of this problem, that he said, "I devoted my whole life, in effect, to preparing for and being able to stop this monster from conquering Europe. And the upshot is a different monster conquered Europe." Now that's a bummer. Okay, I mean, you think you've tried to work hard at something and it didn't quite turn out right? That's something that didn't quite, and Churchill said as much. He knew that sort of worried him now and then. Okay, but there you go. All right, so even when you do something kind of new, it can be grabbed. So these examples are a little more interesting or funny. Not interesting, but funny. There was, you ever see the dancing school crossing guards? That's what I think. People who direct traffic at school crossings, you know, and they tweet, tweet, you know, this kind of stuff, and they're direct. Well, there was a lady like this when I was in elementary school who did this near where I lived, right, outside the school. And it was a three-way intersection. She's, you know, making all these waves and doing stuff. And everybody thought this is fabulous. And the local newspaper did a big story about her, and they had a series of these photos, you know, of her in different positions, and you know, and the whistle was all part of the shtick. And we thought this was fabulous, right? And then I went to college, and I was down there, and one day I'm reading the paper down there, and there are a series of photos. The dancing school crossing guard. Like, other people had thought of this too. And it turns out it's a shtick, right? There are a number of people who do this kind of thing. And what looks like an incredible novelty, an unusual situation, turns out to be much more common than you'd thought. Different example of this, Jean-Paul Sartre won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1950. And guess what? He said, I don't want to be seen as a Nobel Prize winner. I refuse, because he's an existentialist, right? And he's like, oh no, that would violate my freedom. I'm not going to be labeled. So he refused the Nobel Prize. And you know what happened? Now on the back jacket of his books, it says, he refused the Nobel Prize. Right? And you know what else? He's not the only person who's done that. It's now a thing. People refuse the Nobel Prize. Because you still kind of got it, and everybody knows that, right? You know, it works. But then you've got some extra thing going on, right? So there's a type for that. This is all about typification, you see. We talked about the first week or two and how we classify people and events, and that's what happens. And even things like revolutions, I have down here, people know how to do a revolution. What do? You march in the streets, right? You put up barricades in the streets. They do that a lot. They publish pamphlets. If you want to be a terrorist, what do you do? What do you do? Used to be hijack airplanes. That was a thing for about 20 years. Terrorists would always hijack airplanes. Now, suicide bombs. That's the way that way people know you're a terrorist, right? It's almost like there's a recipe sheet of how to be a terrorist, and the way you could sit down and write a list of how to have fun on weekends, write down 5 or 6. You could write down how to be a terrorist and go through that list. It becomes a typified way of gearing into the world and operating with other people. All right? And the extreme case of this kind of novelty being absorbed is something like one day you have a revelation, or you go up on the mountaintop and there's a burning bush or whatever, and God speaks to you. All right? And you're so moved, you start a church. You say, I can't let this go. You know, God just spoke to me and told me, do this and this and this. And so I come back down the mountain, or I get people together and say, God has spoken to me. I've got these tablets, or I don't know how it works. You know, you read the Bible, there are a bunch of different ways this can go. You tell people, no, we need to get right with God, and here's what we're going to do. And people go, oh, yeah, you're a prophet, you know, or you're the Messiah or something. And they start following you, and then they set up rules, and then pretty soon they're like sub-messiahs, or disciples, or whatever you want to call them, or priests, or they're people. Next thing you know, half the people in the world are going to church on Sundays, and on Wednesday night they have a dinner, you know, and eat pancakes. And there's a kind of routine to it, and there's what Max Weber called the routinization of charisma, where what was a spontaneous, you might say even genuine conversation with God then becomes a routine that millions of people go through every week, and they sort of get a little bit of a buzz. But it's not the same thing, right? It's not the same thing. That this genuine creative experience kind of gets reabsorbed into ordinary daily life. And so this is all about how things we do or try to do, you know, great example. You fall in love. Okay, so you fall in love. And you want to tell your friend, you say, guess what? I've fallen in love. And they're like, oh, yeah, I've done that, dude. Like, no, wait, back up. Oh. So I can imagine myself saying this to my particular guy I knew in college. And you know, and he's like, oh, yeah. And he's, what about, you know, he's going through like 8 different women. And I'm like, no, this is special. I'm trying to say, no, I'm actually in love. He's like, oh, yeah, great. Blah, 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 you know, what is it? The word doesn't work. Right? The word doesn't work because it's too ordinary, or it's too routinized. You know, or you say to somebody, I love you. And Woody Allen has a great shtick about this. And where is that? Is that in Annie Hall? Yeah, he says, I love you. He says, no, I don't love you. I love you. I love you. Because he's trying to get out of, you know, there's this dictionary word. And he's trying to say, no, this actually is something special or different or unique or something. But it gets reabsorbed back in, and then we, you know. Anyway, so a couple of other examples of this kind of thing. We even rob ourselves. I think of all this as robbery. That is, you try to do something you try to create something and it gets taken away from you in lots of ways. Or, yeah, yeah, I think Sartre does say something about this. You know, you write a book, and once you've written it, it's out there. It ain't your book anymore. You know, some other people are going to read it. They're going to see it the way they want to see it. And maybe they'll like it, or maybe they'll think it's a great statement about X when you thought it was about Y. Doesn't matter. You don't control that. But you can rob from yourself in the sense of you can people now would say disrespect, although I don't think of it as a verb, but you can disrespect your own past, let's say. So when I was very little, I was like 3 or 4 years old, we had a car, we had this Pontiac station wagon that we had since I was born. And at some point, one day, you know, my parents needed a new car, so they got a new car. And I remember my father backing this car, this old Pontiac, backing it out of the driveway, and I knew, I started crying. I was a little kid. Because there goes the car. It's the only car we'd ever had. I'm getting kind of choked up right now again. And you know, and then I got older and I thought, well, that was kind of silly. Why? You know, why was that silly? Because a 3-year-old doesn't count? Is that what it is? You know? Or you see a little kid, you know, you say something, you know, the kid's acting up, you know, the mom says, you know, or smacks him or something, the kid starts crying. Oh, she just had her feelings hurt. Like, oh, that doesn't matter. Why is that? Because somehow it's not legitimate being 5, you know? Or when I was 12, we had a cat. We had this beautiful, big, semi-Persian cat named Sam, who had the bad habit of catching rats down by the river and bringing them up to our house. And one day, one of the rats bit my little brother. Anyway, so I came home from school. Sam's gone. Sam went to the farm. Oh, yeah. Oh. I said, where's Sam? My mom's like, we had this. She tells me this story. You know, since Sam, he's on a farm somewhere and he's happy chasing rats. I learned, you know, many years later I discovered this is a cliche, right? But fine, you know. And I didn't blame my parents. I really didn't. I like, you know, he was bringing rats up. You know what I'm saying? You can't do that. I got that. But I was devastated for a couple of days. Right? And then, you know, 6 years later, I thought, well, that was kind of silly. Why I should have been all upset about the cat. Now I'm like, give the kid a break. You know, it was a big deal. Right? I really love this cat. My father loved this cat. I mean, it was good. It was good. But you know, a lot of times it's so easy to dismiss even your own past experiences. Routine example of this I think of is when you get sick. So a few times in my life I've been really unpleasantly sick. Thank God, only a few times. But like, you know, screaming in pain kind of thing, or violently nauseous or whatever. It's not good. I know that part. But trying to remember what it's like is very difficult. Trying to remember what it actually is like to be sick is very hard. And instead, it's easy to slip back into what I think of as the arrogance of health. Once you're healthy again, you're like, yeah. Okay, things are good. You know, there was a little glitch now. Hey, no big deal. You know, and somebody else is sick, you're like, oh, I'm sorry, bud, that's a drag. Right? But there's that, you sort of forget your own vulnerability is what it is, which is a good thing. I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't. Otherwise, you walk around being miserable a lot. But there's a kind of arrogance to it. Yeah, okay. So robbing your own self is the theme here, like how it's easy to get detached from all of these experiences. I'll give you one other example of that, and then we'll wrap up, which is the college admissions essay is an art form to itself, and there are lots of books actually written on writing college essays. And people have written funny articles. You can go online and find articles about what to do and what not to do, and like the worst college essay strategy and things of that sort. And they'll say, admissions people who read thousands of these things will say there are standard genres, right? The classic being the big game that I either won or lost, and how that affected me. Right? Another is the genre I just mentioned, pet death. Right? Like I was close to this animal and the animal died. Well, what are you supposed to do? Right? Those actually are important things for people. You know, and there you are in your life, and you know, it turns out you're not the first person who twisted their ankle a week before the championships. Turns out it happens to a lot of people, and it's a big deal to a lot of people. Or, you know, somebody dies at a, you know, and it's upsetting, or a pet dies, or, you know, so I guess there's no answer here. That's part of the problem. I'm not recommending you try to avoid cliches in your writing, although I do, but it's damned hard to do, because things are cliches for a reason, because they come up a lot. Right? So, anyway. So, all right, where are we here? Chelsea, help me. Oh, yeah. Okay. So, here's the transition back into sociology. So, because we realize that this is how the world works, that is, we realize that we do things and they get misunderstood, or we try to act in a certain way and it gets reinterpreted. Because we realize that, we act in accordance with that understanding. That is to say, we prepare to be seen as objects. So you can go out there and just be exuberant and be yourself and do your thing as a kind of pure freedom, you might say. But the fact is, other people are going to respond. And you know that. And so you have to adjust your actions accordingly. So Goffman is all over this idea, right? He's all about preparing to be seen by other people. Not just seen physically, although that's obviously important, but how you act and what you say, the words you use, and the way you act. All of that. You're projecting yourself in the kind of future perfect tense. That is, I will have, what was future perfect? I will have been seen is what I'm thinking. All right, you kind of jump out into your future and look back and say, who is the person I will want to have become? All right? So, all right, to finish. This is a kind of fundamental insight in microsociology, that we see ourselves as other people see us, or we try to see ourselves as other people see us. There's Charles Cooley referred to it as the looking glass self. You try to look in the mirror and see, and we literally will look in the mirror and try to, oh, don't do that. People will think you're a dork. You know, better tuck that collar in. You dress certain ways, or you do your hair a certain way, or you carry your... I look at these videos every week after we... It's awful. For one thing, I drift to the right. Do you notice that? Y'all feel that at all? I think I keep drifting to the right. I've been trying not to today. And there's the posture thing. Okay, bless you. And there are certain gestures. Actually, a couple of weeks from now, I'll do a thing. I'll tell you about gestures. All these gestures, I haven't where they came from. You can actually go through one of these tapes and freeze frame. And say, oh, that's from my brother Alex. That's from my brother Tom. That's from my college teacher, Penny Rosal. That's from a psych teacher I had. Like that, right? It's true for all of us. It's true for all of you. Your gestures themselves are a paste up of what you've picked up from a lot of other people in a lot of ways. Okay, so is that the end?
Yes, flip it over.
I thought there was a 6. There is a 6. Yeah, okay. Here, let's do that. So, the self, then, when we talk about the self, then, it includes yourself as a subject and yourself as an object. Now, just so you know, if you're on top of things here, we're going to try to overcome the dualism problem here. That is, as we go on in the course, we're going to try to get away from thinking of these two sides, because that's not how we actually live. We actually live all at the same time. Right? But it's convenient for the discussion to think of yourself as having two sides to it, right? One is the self as a subject, and the other is the self as an object. Gets referred to in different authors in lots of different ways. George Herbert Mead talks about the I and the me. Jean-Paul Sartre talks about the for itself and the in itself, the pour soi and the en soi. The subject and object is another way of thinking of it. But you realize that all of these have the limitation that they're kind of like nouns. And we're used to thinking of ourselves as nouns. When I say, who are you, you give me your name, which kind of reifies you. It makes you like a thing if you're a noun. Whereas you could think of yourself, and that's true subject or object, right? You're a noun in our language, which is a real limitation. So you might think of yourself as a kind of game here. Try to think of yourself as a verb. Right? So I could tell you from having known people who died, that once you're dead, there's this physical thing is still there, but the person is not. That's quite clear. Because the person is much more about doing in various ways, even the way, the way somebody looks at you, or moves their head, or gestures, or whatever. I was walking from my car this morning, and I saw a student walking across campus, and I recognized the person by the way she walked. Totally bundled up. I'm like, I bet that's so and so, right? Because that's who you are, right? You're a verb. You're a verb. You're a lot of different ways of doing things. So try to think about, who would be Jose or Emily or Emma or whatever, as a doing of those. Like, how can I be glorying, as it were? Right? What would that mean? Can you describe that as a verb? And if you really want to get funky, go for being a preposition. Right? Think about what that would. I'm not joking. I mean, I am a little joking, but it's try to figure out what that would be, because in some ways you are. Right? Okay. So what we're going to do next week is, so this Thursday we're going to talk about Oliver Sacks, who is great on all this kind of stuff, and you'll see how it really synthesizes a lot of what we've talked about nicely. And next week we'll get into Sartre's argument about how people deal with the problem of what I've called robbery, the problem of responsibility. That is, the fact that you're free and yet responsible for what happens. Sartre says this is a big issue in human psychology, and it's kind of really the linchpin that connects freedom and social science. Okay? Thanks very much. Have a good day.